It's an absolutely extraordinary start to a conference. You have a spanking new leader here expecting absolute adulation. Instead, Liz Truss has to open the conference making an apology. The apology she made was for the comms, as it were, the communication strategy around her policy. But then Michael Gove, who speaks actually on behalf of quite a few Tory MPs at this exact moment, went around saying, well, it's not comms, it's policy. And that's what you've got wrong, and it's unconservative. But the people who think the same way as Michael Gove are in a sort of checkmate situation. If they were to try to depose Liz Truss, the party could become even more of a laughing stock than it is in some quarters right now. And there would be an instant general election, which would bring its own misery, you would think, if it happened any time soon for the Conservative Party.
Well, I mean, it's day one. It's not completely jam-packed, is it, in truth? How does this compare to Tory conferences normally? It's
very interesting. The opening moment of the conference in the hall, I was in there, I would say it wasn't even two-thirds full. And as Liz Truss came in, the darling of the grassroots, just elected by them, an awful lot of people didn't clap, some stood up, some clapped lightly. It was, at best, I think, a patchy reception.
Just over an hour ago, Liz Truss arrived in the hall for the start of her first conference as leader. The Prime Minister got a warm but not ecstatic response from those who'd made it in. There was a brief, whispered word with her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. 3.5 weeks into her premiership, she's having to explain how both of them shocked the markets and boosted the cost of borrowing.
I do accept we should have laid the ground better. I do accept that.
You accept you should have laid the ground better.
I have learnt from that. I have learnt from that, and I will make sure that in future we do a better job of laying the ground.
But Liz Truss's growing army of critics say the mistakes go well beyond messaging and that the Prime Minister is carving out a completely new direction in policy without much backing.
Are you going to cut spending on public services?
Well, what I'm going to do is make sure we get value for money for the taxpayer.
Did you discuss scrapping the top rate with your whole cabinet?
No. No, we didn't. It was a decision that the Chancellor made.
Sitting in front of the Prime Minister, her former cabinet colleague Michael Gove, who gave his verdict as she left the studio.
When you have additional billions of pounds in play, to have as your principal decision the headline tax move, cutting tax for the wealthiest, that is a display of the wrong values.
And will you vote for these measures?
Michael Gove may be one of the few prominent Rishi Sunak supporters to make the journey to Birmingham, but he speaks for many of them. The party chairman said any Tory MPs who do vote against the mini-budget could lose the whip.
Those who vote against a government's finance bill, that's generally interpreted as a vote of no confidence, and under those circumstances the whip is removed. But I think a very important point here is, of course, it's all got to be done in a way that is politically possible, and it could be that the level of dissatisfaction is so large that that kind of threat, doesn't really cut it. So.
We're just all enjoying party conference, as I'm sure you can.
How's the Prime Minister doing?
Excuse me. Sorry.
What do you want to hear from the Prime?
Sorry.
Party merchandise for a brand new leader would normally be flying off the shelves at an event like this.
And I'm in need of a coffee cup, and I like Liz, so...
You do? Think she's doing a good job so far?
I don't think she's doing as bad as the media are making out.
In these strange times, ardent supporters are caveating their adulation. Brand new ministers get asked if they'll back their new boss's budget.
Of course I'll support the Conservative budget. Conservative budgets drive growth, and we know that for many years.
Less of a novelty than at Labour's conference, but they all know Labour last week stole this ritual and their poll lead on managing the economy. There is huge concern in this party about how they win it back, and no agreed plan for doing so.
Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the Education Secretary, Kit Malthouse, and I asked him what more Liz Truss should have done to lay the ground for her tax cuts.
Well, I think the Prime Minister advertised what she was going to do quite clearly, as far as I was concerned, during the leadership election campaign, but it's pretty obvious from the way the market and others reacted that people hadn't kind of cottoned on to the scale of change that she was proposing. So I think probably what she was indicating was that maybe a bit more picture rolling. Admittedly, things were difficult. We obviously had the death of the Queen, which covered a lot of the time between then and now, but she made a very clear commitment that she would move extremely quickly on becoming leader, and that's what she did. Now,
but she didn't mention the top rate tax scrapping, did she? The tax cuts for the very rich, which she could have done during the leadership election. I suppose that's what laying the ground might have been.
She did mention tax cuts. But like you would expect with most of those kind of fiscal measures, you don't necessarily advertise them in advance. When you get into office,
so she should
sit
have said
down with
more,
your Chancellor.
is what she's saying.
Well, she probably also didn't know who her Chancellor was. But I think she has admitted this morning that a bit more pitch rolling might have helped things land more easily, and of course get people ready for the scale of change that she's proposed. And change is often difficult.
Michael Gove says this budget is not conservative. Borrowing to fund tax cuts is not conservative, and it's full of mistakes. Why is he wrong?
Well, I have to confess to you, I disagree with Michael. It might come as news to some people, but we've been running a deficit for a long time in this country, and presumably we've been running that deficit to maintain taxes where they are. So in effect, we have been borrowing to maintain taxes where they are at the moment. Our firm conviction, I know the Prime Minister's made this very clear, is that if we're going to get out of this doom loop of anemic growth, particularly post-COVID, right, we really have to jolt the economy. And that means putting through significant changes, not just to the fiscal regime, but also on what they call the supply side, which actually means just making it easier to make money and people going to work. Right?
But how are people supposed to afford their mortgages now that they're going to 5, 6, 7, 8%?
Well, look, the two things are not necessarily linked.
Well, they are, because they're linked by the bond rate.
We've seen interest rates rise across the globe. They're higher in the US than they are here. Yeah. They're rising across the rest of the globe as everybody deals with this global inflation. So there was always upward pressure on interest rates.
But you do know that 5-year mortgages are linked to 5-year bond yields.
Absolutely. But, Christian, you've got to remember that all these things are balanced. The Bank of England was forecasting a long and deep recession, right, which is going to be very damaging to people across the country. The idea that the government should sit back on its heels and do nothing about that seems to me a dereliction of duty.
Well, if you sort of want to dodge the blame for it, how are people going to afford the bills?
Well, they'll afford the bills by us having a strongly growing economy.
Next year.
And one that is providing employment, one that is providing assistance to people where they need it.
I'm talking about in the next few
months. The welfare
months.
System. Well,
growth is years away, isn't it?
No, growth could come quite quickly.
Could it be next year?
It could come next year, yes, absolutely. And don't forget, a lot of the tax measures that have been proposed won't kick in until next year either.
Exactly.
And
so how is growth going to come after April?
Hold on,
when mortgage rates are already going up now.
Everybody's forecasting interest rate growth, but we haven't necessarily seen that yet.
Yes, we have.
Well, we've seen some, but the Bank of England hasn't been nowhere near.
The mortgage rates that are available today are much more expensive than they were a week ago.
The point is, Christian, that all these things have to be set in balance, and critical at the base of it all has to be a strong economy. Right, we need to have an economy that employs people, gives them jobs, builds the houses that allows them to pay their mortgages. Now, our growth rate has not been brilliant over the last few years. Even worse post-COVID.
Under the Conservative government.
Well, we had a pandemic to deal with, and we've also had a global
war. But you
war.
talk as if you haven't been in government.
No, but we've had a global pandemic and a war that has caused chaos across the world. Plus, don't forget, for the first half of the decade, we were dealing with the aftermath of a huge global crash. Yeah. So we've been trying our best to get everybody through in decent shape. We now think that the time has come to really put the kind of electric shock treatment through the economy and get it growing, not least for young people, not for people like you and me. We're doing all right, but young people.
It's going to mean public spending cuts, isn't it, in the real world? So how much is the education budget going to be squeezed by, remembering that schools are already facing massive budget squeezes because of inflation?
Well, look, as we said, it was always going to be challenging, but I don't think I necessarily accept your premise, right? If you have a bigger part...
Well, the Prime Minister wouldn't deny it today, which is a sure sign that's coming.
But if she's not going to give you a running commentary on negotiations between departments, and neither am I. But if we have a strongly growing economy, this has always been at the root of what we tried to do. You have a strong economy, you can pay for public services.
The Treasury's telling you to find the efficiency savings.
I haven't been
Do you
told
think schools are sort of hugely inefficient?
I haven't been told to find any efficiency savings so far. I've only been in the job 3 weeks, but I haven't had that conversation yet.
Well, I mean, the Chief Secretary said that everyone was going to have to find efficiency savings. That doesn't apply to schools, is that right?
Well, look, the DfE in its entirety has to constantly think about how it spends its money and make sure that is as efficient as possible.
Ordinary members were talking about getting rid of Liz Truss. I mean, that's not normal, is it, on day one?
Well, I mean, I find that a bit bonkers, if I'm honest with you. As far as I'm concerned, she's done exactly what she said she would do during the leadership election campaign. She was very clear she would move quickly, very clear she would support people in a big way on energy, and that she would look to the tax system to go for growth. And that's exactly what she's doing. She said today, there's more that could have been done to roll the pitch. now that we've learned that lesson, I'm sure as we get towards the end of November, the plan will become clear.
Kit Morehouse, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your time.